Good morning. I'm Tom Forbes and glad to welcome all of you for the last day of our 2023 PAAT Institute. We've got a great finishing event with a program on the campaign season coming up and what will happen beyond that. A couple of housekeeping matters. If you have questions during the discussion, which we hope you will have, there will be many, please submit them via the chat or the Q&A function on the screen. Also, for those of you who are lawyers, continuing legal education credit is pending, and we'll announce that as soon as we get the approval from the State Bar, which is imminent. If you're not currently a member of PAAT, we hope you will consider joining. In fact, I learned a few minutes ago that we have at least one of you has joined us today. So hopefully more will take advantage of this opportunity and join us as a member of PAAT. We are continuing our monthly Nerdy for 30 series in 2024, which have been very well received, and those events will continue to be free for PAAT members. Now for today, our panel discussion, as I mentioned, is about the campaign season and politics beyond that. We have a terrific panel of great friends of PAAT. Our moderator, Jim Henson, who is the leader of the Texas Politics Project at the University of Texas at Austin. And he'll be joined by Gromer Jeffers, the political reporter for the Dallas Morning News, and Harvey Kronberg, the publisher of the Quorum Report. We expect to conclude by 11 or 11:15 or so, depending on questions. And with that, Jim, I'll turn it over to you and look forward to this discussion.
Thanks a lot, Tom. It's, of course, great to be back. So welcome back to everybody who's been to this party before. It's good to see Gromer and Harvey again. And happy holidays to everyone watching. My view of this is that, we're here to take stock of things as the clock runs out on the fourth special session, even as primary election is heating up pretty significantly. Filing deadline for primaries by 10 days away. Special session is ending next week. So, I want to start before we move into the primary handicapping with, some mixture of the speculative and the practical with our panelists. Are we hearing any rumblings about the resurrection of vouchers, ESAs? Is there going to be anything else happening in the remaining days of the session, or is it just over? Gromer, what do you think?
I think for the remaining days of the session it's over. But I'm hearing there's still dialogue going on, that the framers of the latest failed proposal is still trying to work with other lawmakers and the governor to get something done, with the hopes, and this is probably a long shot, that maybe if they get an agreement, they can call them back in January or February. Of course, that would be in the heat of the campaign. During our last session, we talked about how that would probably be not all that workable and controversial, but still, I think they're working toward it. But as of now, it just doesn't seem that they're there yet.
Harvey, what are you hearing based on what you're, you having your ear to the ground? What's your sense of this?
There may have been a little bit of erosion among the 24 once rock solid Republicans. They may be down to 21 now that oppose vouchers on the House side, but we've only got 5 or 6 Republicans that have not yet announced for whether they're going to run for re-election or not. And I don't see anything moving the needle on those remaining 21 plus the Democrats. There is some talk that I heard yesterday, but have not yet confirmed, that the Senate may suspend rules and pass another safety bill. There is also a constituency in the House right now to go ahead and take Senate Bill 2, which is the funding portion of all this, pass it and send it to the governor, and have him challenge him to veto a teacher pay raise, which is essentially what the big enticement in Senate Bill 2. Put that on the governor's desk, since the governor has been so dramatic about challenging the legislature at every turn.
Would there be enough consensus? I mean, what are the odds of there being enough consensus between the House and the Senate for something like that to happen?
Well, the Senate's already passed it and sent it over to the House. So haven't they already? Yeah, they passed Senate Bill 2.
But will the Senate take away the governor's bargaining chip on school choice? I guess that's the question.
Yeah. I mean, what do you think, Harvey? I mean,
oh no.
How do you assess the odds of that? I mean, there've been variations of that kind of floating around as an idea, but I wonder, is there really the will to pull the trigger on that?
They just took the Senate, but SB 2 didn't change it at all, passed it, sent it to the governor. Then the governor, it's up to the governor to veto a teacher pay raise.
Yeah.
Go ahead. I'm sorry, Gromer.
No. I think the only hiccup with that is that it would give the House a real big victory, because not only would they get teacher pay raises, but it wouldn't be attached to vouchers. And I'm not sure Patrick would be able to stand that, but
it doesn't make any difference if it's already passed and over to the House. If you don't change it, it doesn't have to go to conference. And there's enough good things that the school districts want and superintendents want, and doesn't have vouchers, that it's kind of like when the governor vetoed the legislative budget.
Right.
If the speaker had simply said all these other items on the special session call were interesting, but we're not doing anything until the legislative budget is restored, it would have put it back on Abbott's plate, instead of right now the House is just all the Republican information and misinformation machines are focusing on the House, and that would put the focus of the conversation back on the governor. It will also potentially energize teachers to participate in the upcoming primary.
So you would force them to veto it, essentially.
Correct.
and suffer the political ramifications of that.
Well, I mean, and that's what I meant. I mean, in terms of the question before, Harvey, is not that, I mean, I can see the procedural path is pretty clear, but the process is not the obstacle in this case, right? I mean, I get, the question is, have things deteriorated between the House leadership and the governor to the point that the House leadership would put the governor on the spot that way?
He has been averse in the past to doing that. Again, I point to the legislative veto of the legislative budget, but he has to show resolve and give his members, his Republicans, something to go back home with, at least in terms of public education or education in general. And it's very hard for me to see how it obviously neither the governor, the lieutenant governor, or the speaker want to give anybody else a victory, but the governor is running a race against the speaker, the lieutenant governor is running a race against the speaker, and Ken Paxton is running a race against the speaker. I think that would be a fairly bold statement. I'm sure there's something that I'm not aware of that might intervene, but it looks like a pretty straightforward path to move the focus back onto the governor.
So let's, that actually sets up for something the gravity of talking about the primaries. I mean, that gravity is exerting itself on the process, and it's going to exert itself on this conversation. But the way that you set that up, Harvey, does set up a question that I wanted to ask you guys. I want to step back for a second before we move completely into the primaries. It's obviously just been, I'm not sure what the right adjective is, a very colorful legislative session, a very conflicted legislative session. And for the last, 4 to 5 months, the public, I shouldn't even say the public attention, because I think public attention has not been focused on much of this at all based on what we've seen. But our attention, and the attention of many people that are likely to be watching this, has really been focused on a relatively small set of issues, aside from the issues our audience is working on for clients that are narrower. But, we've been focused, going back to the summer at least, if not a little further, on the Paxton impeachment, on vouchers, on the border. And, you mentioned, and then the educational issues that have bubbled around vouchers and are attendant to the political fight around them, teacher pay, et cetera. But, if you go back and you look at the regular session, the legislature did a lot of other things during the session that have really faded into the background. Now, both of you have covered a lot of sessions. Stepping back and looking at this session holistically, isn't it fair that they did get some significant things done, however subject to criticism of the specifics they are, and that, a lot of these candidates do in fact have a lot to campaign on?
Well, the biggest thing, obviously, that impacts a whole bunch of people is the $18 billion property tax cut. I mean, they got it done. And I think that's going to have a real impact on when people open up their tax bills. That's a pretty significant cut that they're going to get. They'll be able to point to that, members of both parties, and say, look, we did put something back, give you back some of your money, put something back in your pocket. So there's that. To the extent that it's overshadowed by all this other stuff, I don't know. But at the end of the day, you may be onto something there, Jim, that Paxton's impeachment, whether or not we have vouchers, those are issues that maybe they don't impact the average citizen, the average Texan, as much as it impacts us and maybe the education community. You know what I mean? So
Yeah.
I do think property tax cuts, and maybe there's some other things that got done, will be the lasting legacy of this session.
Yeah, I mean, and look, I'm not one to, downplay the conflict or, the heat that we're feeling or the institutional thrashing we're seeing. But, if you step back and you look at what they produced during the session, and I'm not saying it was a great session, or I'm not cheerleading for the leadership,
right.
But I mean, I think you can say, look, for years, you've got a lot of people saying we're not doing enough about water, we're not doing enough about transportation, we're not doing enough about broadband. These are not issues that get primary voters, blood boiling one way or the other. But, it was also a session in which there were some resources. The grid, and again, the grid is back in the news given what ERCOT did. But I just, it does feel to me a little bit like we've all, and I include myself in this, we tend to get a little bit myopic on the things that are hottest and conflict driven. And it's fair to say may or may not be salient in a primary. But it does seem to me that these members do have things to run on, even in a primary, not the least of which is the piles of money still being thrown at the border. I mean, Harvey?
Although you can argue whether that's good or not, and before Harvey speaks, I don't think this was, say, like a session like the 2019 session coming off the Republican losses of 2018. I think they got a lot done there. I think that was a more successful.
I would say it was somewhere, it was somewhere between 19 and 21.
Right. Well, go ahead.
Go ahead, Harv.
Yeah. I'm going to do something I never thought in my adult life I would ever do. I'm going to send you to a Michael Quinn Sullivan tweet, which he just did Dade Phelan the honor of broadcasting or replaying one of his commercials. He's obviously been under attack since the beginning of the session in his district. He's got 3 opponents right now. But if you want to see the template for Republicans bragging about their accomplishments going into the primary, I would suggest taking a look at the Dade Phelan spot. It's a whole series of positive Republican accomplishments. Of course, as we know, the mailers that are going to come in and last minute TV ads will be slightly, we call it the Republican misinformation machine, but the attack ads will start at some point. But the template for Republicans being able to take a victory lap was pretty clear in the Phelan commercial.
So that does get us to the primary. So let's talk about the primary. We can circle back. Actually, you know what? Before we talk about the primary, I do want to ask one thing. So, and this is also transitional. So, what do we make, given this conversation, about, the tension between, I don't know what you want to call them, the dissident Republican, activist groups versus, quote unquote, the establishment and the fight to displace incumbents in particular in the House. How do you factor where Greg Abbott has been in the last week or 10 days into that? Because, it's been a very interesting, several days for the governor. I mean, we've seen, I don't want to call them high profile moves, but a series of attention grabbing moves aimed at different broader audiences that are pretty interesting to me, right? From endorsing Donald Trump in the presidential primary to, skydiving to beginning to dribble out endorsements of primary opponents of a couple of Republican incumbents who voted against vouchers. So, so where do you position the governor in this, and as we go into the primaries, allowing for your point a minute ago, Harvey, that the underlying dynamic in which neither the lieutenant governor nor the speaker nor the governor seem willing to do anything that will make the others look especially good right now. How do you position the governor in this discussion about, the glass half full or the glass half empty as you're making the case to primary voters?
I can't help but chuckle, but the metaphor of him jumping out of a plane is either positive or negative, depending on your point of view.
Well, it all depends on the outcome, right? And
Right.
it's positive.
Right. But from my perspective, I think the governor has not been particularly successful in House primaries. The last time we saw him really engage, he lost 2 out of 3.
And that was 2018.
Right.
And all kind of interesting races, but we can come back to that as necessary.
Different world, but
in a very different world. Yeah.
You probably know better than I do, but anecdotally, I think the governor's approval rating is fairly upscale right now, or fairly high among Republican voters. Although he was underwater for years, but for the moment he's doing well, unless we have some kind of externality. But I'm not sure how compelling he is. The bigger issue is how Defend Texas Liberty and its allies are going to spend their money. Interestingly, they opposed Governor Abbott in the primary, but they're going to be allied with him on some of these House races and how money is going to get spent. But inside the process, he seems to be the rapidly shrinking governor, increasingly shrill. So.
Well, what do you think? What do you think of that? That's a pretty dour assessment. It was a little bit, you wavered there in the end. You kind of delivered the punch. What do you think, Gromer?
Well, I think there are a few things going on here. First, from his personal popularity and viability with the Texas voter, he's just fine, right? There's no chance right now. You can't think of, with the exception of Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick, anybody mounting a credible challenge against him. So he's fine there. It's always been tricky for him, and quite frankly, Rick Perry for that matter, when they try to flex with legislative politics or get involved in primary races. I mean, Harvey pointed out 2018, I believe it was.
Yes.
And we wrote about that. That was an embarrassing moment for him. And so I'm mildly surprised that he's using the fight for vouchers to make this kind of effort in these primaries, particularly since it's all muddied up with the Paxton element and all other kinds of things going on. You may ultimately have some sort of speaker fight. And it's just interesting that he's getting involved in the situation where you're going to have sort of a two-pronged assault against Dade Phelan and some House incumbents. And I'll say this finally, that I feel like Abbott has always wanted to be America's governor or America's Republican governor. And that's why having total victory on his agenda is so important. Going into 2024, he'll be able to sit next to Trump and others and say, we got this done, we got this done. And his name, I'm not saying that he will be on a short list or anything, but certainly his name, if will pop up or as a potential running mate or high cabinet official or something like that. That's what he would want. And remember, he came into this whole process when he was running for re-election with the goal, I think, of being a contender in 2024, and that did not happen. But he still wants to be America's Republican governor. I think that's important to him.
There's two risks I think he faces right now. So say he makes endorsements in 21 races and wins 3. Obviously, House members would like to be on the governor's good side, but this is the first time he's actually aggressively participated in primaries. He's challenging incumbents, going for open seats. If he loses the majority of those, or if his candidates lose the majority of those races, his political capital inside the Capitol diminishes. And the second thing is, if some of these are pretty good candidates, challengers, I mean, respectfully, some are deeply flawed, but we're not even talking yet about November. There's a lot of issues that are going to be litigated in November, and if you put a number of, just for shorthand, extreme Republicans is the new face of the Republican Party, then it creates opportunities for Democrats. Remember, it was a presidential year that the House went 76-74. You've only got to move 10 to accomplish essentially the same thing right now. And who knows what the externalities are going to be nationally, but if Abbott is responsible for changing the field and Democrats end up making gains, whatever tactical advantage he had is going to be pretty much muted in the next session.
Well, Harvey, I will say this. You're absolutely right about that, especially in urban areas. In Dallas County, for instance, remember Jason Villalba, the Republican, represented a North Dallas district, was viewed as too moderate by some. We got a challenge from Lisa Luby Ryan, I believe. It was to his right. She won. Republicans lost that seat when John Turner emerged and took it. Morgan Meyer is facing a challenge. And there are just 2 Republicans left from Dallas County, Morgan Meyer, Angie Chin Button. So if you get someone, if Morgan Meyer's opponent, if he loses and the winner of that primary is not as strong as he is, then Democrats can take that seat. And you're right, that could play out in other parts of the state. And then you get blamed for that.
Yes, we tend to think tactically right now and episodically, but there is a bigger blame.
Yeah, I mean that.
And I'm not sure that the governor is involved in that race, but I'm just saying that I'm backing up Harvey's contention that there is a scenario where more extreme Republicans can hurt in a general election.
And as long as, if I may, one more thing, Jim. Abortion has yet to be litigated in Texas. And while most of the pro-public education Republicans are in rural Texas, the suburb, it's going to be volatile in depending on our congressional candidate. I mean, our senatorial candidate from the Democratic side. Nobody's really factoring that in as a not a litmus test, but some kind of weighting going into the general election. And so the more extreme the Republican profile looks, given abortion as a subtext, I think that it adds one more element of volatility to the chessboard.
So it seems to me that we're talking about a lot of, there's a lot of forks in the road to get to where we're going there. But I have thoughts about that, but I'm gonna hold them for now. I would just say two quick things,
Whatever they are, I'm sure you disagree with me.
I would just qualify a couple of these things. Look, and I mentioned the forks in the road. It's a very volatile environment out there, and I have no idea what 2008 is going to, or what the November is going to look like. 2008 in terms of the big Democratic flip was, we talked about 2018 being a different political universe. 2008 was a different political galaxy, right? And so
that was Barack Obama.
Exactly.
Right. And and the out Bush year. Now, I do want to, because there's a question in the chat that fits right now. And since we've kind of speculated on this, I'll just say, if somebody's asking, what is the likelihood of Democratic gains in the legislature this election cycle? And since we're speculating on this, just what do you think? Both of you kind of touched on the possibility, but how real is that? It seems like our viewer is asking.
I think the districts are drawn too tight, too much gerrymandering, slight gains at best. I'm
gonna be a little further out there and say that they drew Todd Hunter drew 87. He intended to draw 87 Republican districts. They won 86 of them. I've said this previously. 16 of those districts had Trump performing 57% or lower the last time around, and it's hard for me to think that his numbers will improve. Particularly in those urban and suburban districts. 57%, at least when Dana Chida was still doing her number crunching, she always said that 57% was essentially a swing district. Now, a number of those Republicans outperformed Trump in their elections. But I think that with the field, without getting into presidential optics, it seems to me that there's a possibility of 6 to 8 Democratic gains on paper. And if the one thing Trump has proved since he left office is that he's really good at turning out Democrats and independents. So we shall see.
The only thing I'll be careful about, and you just said it, Republicans outperformed Trump. If you look at 2020, Trump lost Tarrant County, and Biden did well there. But every Republican won, every state house Republican won that race, and that their contest. And Democrats targeted Tarrant County, if you remember, in that cycle. Mm-hmm. And so I don't think it's as simple as maybe Trump on the ballot, but we'll see. I take your point.
Yeah.
Well, there's another question that was submitted earlier, and I'll come back to it. But I think there is a real question that we can't answer right now about what the dynamic is if this looks if what seems to be the highest probability outcome is what happens right now, which we've assumed a little bit here, I think, and it's another Biden-Trump race. Trump is a great Democratic mobilizer, but at this moment, there's a lot of hand-wringing, perhaps deserved, perhaps not, about the fact that Joe Biden might in fact be a great Democratic demobilizer in his second term. So, and I think you kind of flagged this generally when you talked about externalities. I think the externalities are going to, that externality is going to be huge. And we just don't know what that's going to look like a year from now or 11 months from now. I also want to knock out another question from the audience that bears on this a little bit in terms of something you said, Gromer. You talked about the kind of partisan development and the legislative representation in North Texas and Dallas in particular. Talk a little bit about the impact of Mayor Johnson's party switch. And people also want to know, I think, or somebody also asked about this whole thing about Eric Johnson's Republican Mayor's Organization. So can you give us how do you factor Eric Johnson's party switch into that dynamic, the partisan dynamic in the city, And then B, what do you what juicy things can you tell us about the Republican Mayor's Organization? Not to read too much into the question, but that's how I
Yeah,
read the
I mean,
question.
it seems to be right now an organization. I haven't checked back on it, but an organization of one so far. But and I don't say that as a criticism, it's just getting off the ground. But until we see folks like, Fort Worth Mayor Matty Parker and others joining up, we just don't know what kind of thing it will be. But certainly Eric Johnson wants it to be a vehicle to bring attention to what Republican mayors are doing in the cities. Uh, I was a lot of people weren't surprised by his switch. I was mildly surprised by the force in which he made it. It was a big production. The Wall Street Journal. Let me just say, Dallas is the Dallas mayor's post is nonpartisan by nature. You don't
Right.
run as a Republican or a Democrat, and in some ways you turn folks off. They're voters who are Democrats in Dallas who have voted for Republican mayors. The last Republican mayor, Tom Leppert, had some Democratic Party support,
Yeah.
and Mike Rawlings has had Republican support, as well as Eric Johnson, who was a Democrat when he first ran. So it's against tradition, sort of, to blow your horn about I'm about your party affiliation. Johnson has made the decision that it's important to showcase the need for Republican mayors in America, and that's why he says he's doing it. But it's interesting. The other thing is that, and these are questions that he has not answered, the other part of it. What about Donald Trump? What about border policy, immigration policy? What about all the votes that he's taken in the legislature that pretty much, supported what most Democrats in the ledge wanted? So where are you on those issues, the issues involving transgender residents, all of that? I think at some point he'll have to address that, particularly since he's making a big deal out of now being a Republican.
Does it have any practical impact on these legislative races?
No, it's separate. It's about, for now, Johnson and his viability and what he wants to do next and what he wants to do in his second term as mayor, because he's so detached from the legislature now, other than Dallas maybe having a bargaining chip, better bargaining chip now with the Republican controlled legislature. In terms of the legislative races, though, I don't think it'll have an impact. I don't expect him to be out there making endorsements, but you never know, right?
Yeah, I was going to ask him if he had done that.
Yeah.
It didn't seem like he has.
Right.
Purely as an amusing sidebar, I like Mayor Johnson just fine, but we do have to remember at one point he actually filed for speaker.
Yes.
Democrat. And
I'd forgotten that. That's right.
Was upset that we gave him just one paragraph of coverage.
Yeah, he was, because he kept insisting that there was a PAAT. And I was like, Eric, you're a Democrat. How? I mean, how will you get Republicans to vote for you? He insisted there was, and then of course, Bonin came out with the support, and that ended really quickly.
Well, I think you can give Mayor Johnson this. He at least understands the appetite for stories about a speaker's race among the Texas press. So, it was not an implausible swing to give both of you guys a bunch of crap and say, look, I know knowing that you want to write about it, right?
Right.
And if there isn't a speaker's race, we'll do our damnedest to gin
so let's move a little bit more. Let's move a little bit more directly into the primary. So, last count that I got, from the relaunched Texas election source is that we've got at least 38 Republican incumbents who have drawn at least one primary challenger. Of those, that voted against Paxton in the House, A little more than half have at least one announced or filed primary challenger. And of those, as of a couple of days ago, about 10 had 2 primary challengers. So a couple of questions here. I mean, look, I should say, on one hand, I think there's a tendency to play up the drama here, of course, but in some ways, it seems we shouldn't be too surprised. Given the conversation we've already had, given all that we've seen, I don't think anybody should be surprised that it's a pretty active primary season on the Republican side. But on the other hand, there's a lot going on here. I think the question is, does more action definitely mean more turnover? Or, and to what extent? Will we see a change, not just, we see an increase in the number of challenges. Should we expect an increase in the number of successful challenges? I don't think the second necessarily follows from the first. So, a couple of things. How successful do you expect these challenges to be? And second, talk about a couple of races that are out there that you find interesting for the audience.
Well, the most interesting is Dade Phelan, who's drawn three opponents right now, and the intent is obviously clear to drive it to a runoff, which would be even lower turnout, and therefore to make him vulnerable, or presumptively more vulnerable. But he's been on TV now for months and setting himself up. Generally speaking, though, I think that we'll see how Texans for Lawsuit Reform support since they've been so badly maligned in the impeachment trial. We'll see what kind of money they put into defending the impeachment voting Republicans. ART is obviously much more establishment, much less and much more incumbent friendly generally. So Phelan will have sufficient money for, I believe, as of today anyway, he should have sufficient money to be able to defend his incumbents. But by far and away the most interesting and the most understandable race at this time is the one against him.
Gromer, what do you think?
Yeah, we've talked about this a lot, Jim. You and I historically, insurgent candidates haven't fared all that well. So I don't expect a flood of wins for the pro-Paxton folks. You never know, though. It all involves the quality of the candidate. And sometimes you can have money, but the quality isn't there. But having said that, I'll be interested to see what happens in Paxton's home county, Collin County, where Jeff Leach, you remember he made that passionate closing argument at the Senate trial, and put himself out there. Paxton wants to knock him off. He really wants to beat him, and that's his home county. So what happens with Jeff Leach, Matt Shaheen, the freshman lawmaker Frederick Frazier, Candy Noble, all those folks out there, that's going to be a real big fight in a county where they know him best, right? And if he can't have wins in his home county, then what will it say for the rest of the state? So I will be watching that pretty closely.
And remember that at least as of the moment, Paxton has lost in terms of preventing the whistleblowers from taking depositions, which means that story continues to unfold. I think we all anecdotally know one or two circumstances where the FBI or in relation to the San Antonio grand jury has reached out. That's an ongoing narrative. And then I don't know if this is a negative inside the Republican primary, but Defend Texas Liberty becomes, with some of its antics and the exposés about Nick Fuentes, can become a peripheral issue that impacts on the margins. But obviously somebody's going to have to build their brand besides them.
Yeah, and Jim, your earlier question about legislative successes, the incumbents will argue that here's our conservative agenda, here's what we accomplished, and then they will suggest very strongly do you want to align yourself up with a guy, Paxton, who's done this, and that? And it's a nuanced way to do it, but it'll be interesting to see at these forums when he comes up, how the incumbents address the question about Paxton and how much they trash him.
Or how
Because
visible he is, but
yeah,
the ongoing Paxton, today he sued Pfizer over or announced that he was going to sue Pfizer over their COVID vaccine. He can keep himself in typically he can control, an attorney general can control their own narrative. But in this
yeah,
case, you've got at least three legal trails, civil and criminal trails that muddy up his message. And of course, the former president's got 91 indictments, and it doesn't seem to have impacted him. However, the Paxton narrative is far from clear. And I'll add one more thing. If you look at the last state Republican convention, remember that Cornyn got booed for 25 out of the 30 minutes. Greg Abbott was literally afraid to go into the convention and would only have an offsite convention, an offsite reception.
where he gave away beer and food.
In order, and people stood for a mile-long line in 105-degree Houston temperature to get in.
Well, some things in politics don't change.
It
Right,
was a
he said,
Republican
how can they
pachanga.
boo me if I give them beer and food?
Right, it was a Republican pachanga. But and the SREC right now is massive. Is the State Republican Executive Committee is going through a lot of internal battles, and I'm not sure how secure Rinaldi's position is on the SREC. So the looking at all of these have marginal effects on the outcome of the primaries, but they, I think, do have impacts.
So let's step back, and this is a question in part from Tom Forbes, and I was headed this direction, is like, so, we've talked about the Paxton impact in Collin County, which is likely to be disproportionate, I think. I think it's a fair guess, but also, as you suggest, Gromer is going to be an interesting heat check.
Right.
And that's ultimately, to me, a question that I think is looming out there is, just how front and center in voters' minds is, and in what valence is the Paxton trajectory and the Paxton story and Paxton himself going to be. And I think, look, on one hand, one can argue that, again, you referenced our discussions we've had, Gromer, that, look, I mean, the primary is the Attorney General's moment in a lot of ways, in the sense that, our polling showed pretty conclusively that his strongest support throughout his travails has been among voters that identify as very strong Republicans, and even more so as, on the far end of the conservative ideological scale. And these are also voters that are obviously have a higher propensity to vote in primaries. So if he's going to enjoy a receptive audience for his message, the primary is most likely to be the moment. But in that sense, his numbers are, okay. They're better. His job approval and his favorability ratings have recovered to some degree from his low point during the impeachment, but they haven't gone up. Let's put it that way. And I think that in some ways, that's the argument that Paxton's allies were trying to sell, certainly in the immediate aftermath of his acquittal, which is that Trump-like, he is going to be fueled by adversity, that the legal problems and his scrape with the quote unquote corrupt institutions of politics are going to strengthen him. I don't think there's evidence to support that. So I think, the way that you put that, Gromer, that both of you put that, it's going to be an interesting test of these propositions, but I think we're not going to see it ultimately weighed out. I think if he backs some winners in primaries, like anybody who backs any primary winners, he'll emphasize the success and forget about the losses. And to connect that to something we talked about earlier, I mean, we kind of mentioned that in the short term, Governor Abbott was sort of embarrassed by, not succeeding in backing primary candidates. But I would say that embarrassment, was present among a very limited audience. there isn't, the share of voters who will tell you, you know what, I really think Governor Abbott's not as good because he backed these primary challengers in state legislative races that didn't win, is pretty small. And I think it raises the fact that, backing primary candidates and even supporting challengers to primary incumbents is at least as much about pressuring the incumbents and sending a signal to them as it is about actually winning those races.
You just nailed it, Jim. I don't think it has any impact in the world at large, but in the next legislative session, there's going to be some pretty angry, if they return, there'll be some pretty angry incumbents. We've watched the redirection or concentration of power into the executive. I don't know if that could be reversed, but among the senior Republicans in the House, obviously you'd rather be on the governor's good side, but they don't trust him, they don't respect him, and if he is not successful in these challenges, his position is further weakened going into the next legislative session.
I'm kind of moving into. Go ahead, Gromer.
No, go ahead. I agree with you, Jim and Harvey. No incumbent wants a serious to semi-serious challenger. They'll take a barely viable challenger to fundraise off of. But yeah, the next session, and the makeup of the legislature, that's kind of what's at issue. Whether Paxton wins or loses, no one will be thinking about him when they go into the 2025 session in terms of the legislature and what they're trying to accomplish.
I'm gonna move into the Q&A on that a little bit, as we're running short on time, but I mean, I already have to some degree, but there's a question from Denise Davis that actually follows up on, to my mind, on this discussion, right? Which is, we're kind of parsing like who's paying attention to what makes the governor up, what makes him down. But the bigger picture is, there's not been a lot of turnover in the Republican leadership in a long time, other than the Speaker of the House, which I think is explainable. Do we see any signs that we're going to see more turnover more quickly in the next election cycle? Is there any indication of that?
Well,
the next election cycle being 2026.
Yeah, the next state election cycle. Yeah.
I think there's a possibility, and hello, Denise, by the way.
Yes, hi, Denise.
So the whole Pat Fallon situation is interesting because if you guys remember a couple of weeks ago, he had dabbled at not running for re-election to Congress and instead running for state Senate. And the belief is he wanted to be in the state Senate because he had assurances that he would be the successor to Dan Patrick at one point, or at least people would support him in that. And of course, it didn't happen because of politics. But I do think that with Patrick is 73 years old, I believe he is. Abbott is, I believe he may want the record for governor by winning a fourth term for longest serving governor. But beyond that, at some point, they'll have to step aside, and 2026 could be the beginning of that. And so I think you will see people lining up to position themselves to crack through and break through. The Don Buckinghams, the others out there, Christy Craddock, you name them, will be positioning themselves to sort of run for statewide office when and if.
I think it'd be malpractice to not mention the comptroller.
Yeah. Oh, yes. Yeah, you're right. I mean, the money man, right? The guy, who always has the good news,
and who by a not a huge margin, but at least strictly speaking, won by the largest vote share, by the largest margin in the last statewide election.
Yes, exactly. So yeah, but But the question is, I think the big question is, what does Dan Patrick want to do? We know he has a war chest, right, Harvey?
Mere 21 million, including 3 million loan to Israel, 6 million loan to Israel
Yeah.
to buy Israeli
So
bonds.
But he bought low.
Yeah, he hinted, right, that he's running again.
Don't get me started.
Have we heard, Harvey? Didn't he hint that he's running again in 26?
Oh, no, he said he was running again, but frankly, it's very hard to find anybody in the Senate that believes that.
Right. So
the widespread belief is that he did that in order not to be perceived as a lame duck.
a lame duck. So to answer
However,
Denise, yeah.
One of his staffers said that he's a force of nature. Former staffer told me,
yeah.
don't count him out. No matter what you think, he's a force of nature. So, but that starts a whole domino effect of possibilities if that is true.
So it depends on what he wants to do. And Abbott, I do believe Abbott, if he's able to, wants to, if nothing else, clears for him to be the longest serving governor in Texas. He's also said that he wants to run again in 2026.
And I believe that that Abbott is what drives Greg Abbott is that he's and appropriately so. He's extraordinarily competitive. He's had his challenges to overcome, and he's obviously ambitious, but fundamentally he's competitive, and I don't think he can leave the stage unless there's a physical reason. So, or else reason.
Yeah, I want to get a couple quick things so people don't feel like I ignored their question. Money Extra asked if you guys comment on Travis Clardy's race, as a pro-Paxton, anti-voucher House member, where is he in this coming primary season?
Well, I think he's going to have more than enough money to defend himself, but obviously, and I can't remember his opponent's name at the moment, but
it's probably a good sign for him.
But Clardy does pay a lot of attention to his district, but he has not been part of the speaker's team for a while, so he doesn't have leadership to be able to claim. But just based on the facts on the ground today, I'd say on paper he looks vulnerable, but he's about as good a retail operator as I've seen in the district. So,
I'm trying to think if there's people also wanted you all to weigh in on what you're thinking about the Houston mayoral race. Well, you're laughing, Harvey. That volunteers you to respond.
Well, the reason I'm chuckling is because we were talking about Eric Johnson switching to a Republican Party. Houston, what's going to probably determine the outcome of the Houston race is Republicans voting against Sheila Jackson Lee. It is pretty phenomenal that she got 2 Clinton endorsements. I'm not sure how much impact that has in the communities they're trying to reach, but if Whitmire does win, it's going to be one of the strangest coalitions of first responder unions, and Republican business people. And the poll, at least, the polling seems to bear that out. So at the moment, it looks like it's a Whitmire, but who knows?
Yeah, you never know, but you're right. It does. I mean, and it is an interesting coalition. And it just goes to show you what happens with city local politics. You get these strange coalitions that form, and that's kind of the majesty of it, quite frankly. It's all about moving the city forward, not partisan politics, so to speak.
This actually goes back 3 or 4 months where I know that Republican players in Houston were actively trying to keep a big name Republican out of the race, because if there was a big name Republican, it would be Sheila Jackson Lee versus the big name Republican in Harris County. And in that environment, in a runoff, they believe that Sheila Jackson Lee would win.
Yeah.
I think I got most of these. I'm going to hand this back to Tom to.
Let me just
go
say
ahead. Please.
One last thing, interesting thing. 3 open congressional seats in North Texas. Kate Granger's seat, Burgess is retiring, and also Colin Allred is running for Senate. So that would be interesting as well.
Yeah, we
Okay.
haven't talked about that Senate race, and I do want to ask before I hand it back to obviously the layout of this race, all red has huge fundraising advantages, is kind of the anointed the anointed candidate from Washington, D.C. And yet, that primary seems to me to have the potential to be very good for the Democrats if one of the other candidates, I mean, the most likely candidate, here in this scenario would probably be Roland Gutierrez, got some more traction, and Democrats actually had a high visibility competitive primary, would be good for an otherwise, I mean, we haven't talked about the Democrats at all in this conversation. You guys see any chance of that?
If Gutierrez can raise enough money to amplify his message, I'm not sure that that's happening, but that's what he needs to do. Because on the issues, he's more progressive. That's what he's campaigning, as a more progressive candidate, and that's not a bad message in a Democratic Party primary. But if you don't have any money to mount a campaign, then Allward will just bury him in just cash. But you're right about a visible, competitive campaign that fires up the base. That would help going into the race against Cruz. But I bet Allred disagrees with you at this point.
No, well, he clearly does. And look, I mean, the strategy they're pursuing is the right one. They're sitting on their pile of money and ignoring everybody else and assuming projecting that they're going to be the candidate. Understandable, but also, I think not, if you're interested in the political system in the state becoming at all more competitive, not so good.
Gutierrez makes the argument, and it's as best I can tell, it's accurate, that there is a 43 in a Democratic primary, a Hispanic surname delivers 43% by itself, and so and he also points out that his mailing list, his fundraising soliciting list, is about a tenth the size of Allred's. So his 600,000 that he raised compared to Allred's 6 million. It's an interesting argument, but I'm not sure what you do with them. I mean, you spend it on mailers, but a primary election, particularly a Democratic primary election, you can't go on TV. I guess you could go on radio, but I'm not sure what the financial advantage delivers in the primary, in a Democratic primary. We just haven't seen a competitive Democratic primary in so long.
Hey, Tom, I'm going to hand it back to you. Sorry, I bait and switched on you, but
no, that's quite all right. This has been exactly what we look forward to every time we get the opportunity to have you three together, and we appreciate very much your joining us and being such willing participants in our programming. It's very valuable for our members, and we really enjoy the opportunity to have a visit with all of you, Jim, Gromer, and Harvey. And thank you very much for providing this insightful and always interesting discussion. That's all for today, and we will look forward to seeing you again. Thanks to everyone who's attended our institute this week and in this one today. So with that, we'll end our week-long series of programs and end today's. Thanks again. We very much appreciate your
Thanks, guys.
Robert, Jim, everybody else, thank you.
And thanks to Allison too.
Thanks, guys.
As always, thanks, Allison. Take care, everybody.
Thank you,
Have a
Allison.
happy season. Happy whatever your holiday is, enjoy it.
Yes.
Bye, guys. Thank you.
Bye.